The Naval Secretary is the Royal Navy appointment of which the incumbent is responsible for policy direction on personnel management for members of the RN. It is a senior RN appointment, held by an officer holding the rank of Rear Admiral. The Naval Secretary's counterpart in the British Army is the Military Secretary. The Royal Air Force equivalent is the Air Secretary. Naval Secretaries have included 1894 to 1897 Captain Hedworth Lambton, 1897 to 1899 Captain Wilmot Fawkes, 1899 to 1900 Captain Maurice Burke, 1900 to 1902 Captain Wilmot Fawkes, 1902 to 1905 Captain It, 1905 to 1908 Captain Hugh Evan Thomas, 1908 to 1910 Captain Charles Madden, 1911 1912 Rear Admiral Ernest Truebridge, 1912 1913 Rear Admiral David Beatty, 1913 1914 Rear Admiral Dudley.The Chair, August to October 1914 Rear Admiral Horace Hood, October to November 1914 Rear Admiral Henry Oliver, 1914 to 1916 Commodore Charles de Bartolome, 1916 to 1918 Rear Admiral Alan Everett, 1918 to 1921 Rear Admiral Sir Rudolph Bunting, 1921 to 1923 Rear Admiral Hugh Watson, 1923 to 1925 Vice Admiral Michael Hodges, April 1925 Vice Admiral Sir Hubert Brand, 1925 to 1927 Rear Admiral Frank Larkin, 1927 to 1929 Rear Admiral Eric Fullerton, 1929 to 1932 Rear Admiral George Chetwood, 1932 to 1934 Rear Admiral Sidney Merrick, 1934 to 1937 Rear Admiral Guy Royal, 1937 to 1939 Rear Admiral William Whitworth, May to November 1939 Rear Admiral Stuart Bonham Carter, 1939 to 1941 Rear Admiral Edward Cyfray, 1941 1942 Rear Admiral Arthur Peters, 1942 to 1944 Rear Admiral Frederick Dalrymple Hamilton, 1944 1945 Rear Admiral Cecil Harcourt, 1945 1946 Rear Admiral Claude Barry, 1948 to 1948 Rear Admiral Maurice Manzurg, 1948 to 1950 Rear Admiral Peveril William Powlett, 1950 to 1952 Rear Admiral William Davis, 1952 to 1954 Rear Admiral Richard Onslow, 1954 to 1956 Rear Admiral David Luce, 1956 to 1958 Rear Admiral Alistair Ewing, 1958 to 1960 Rear Admiral John Hamilton, 1960 to 1962 Rear Admiral Frank Twiss, 1962 to 1964 Rear Admiral John Hayes, 1964 to 1966 Rear Admiral William O'Brien, January to March 1966 Rear Admiral Anthony Griffin, 1966 1967 Rear Admiral Gervase Cook, 1967 to 1970 Rear Admiral David Dunbar Nasmyth, 1970 to 1972 Rear Admiral Ewan Raikes, 1972 to 1974 Rear Admiral Gordon Tate, 1974 to 1976 Rear Admiral John Forbes, 1976 to 1978 Rear Admiral Peter Buchanan, 1978 to 1980 Rear Admiral Paul Greening, 1980 to 1983 Rear Admiral Richard Fitch, 1983 to 1985 Rear Admiral Richard Thomas, 1985 to 1987 Rear Admiral Roger Dimmick, 1987–1988 Rear Admiral Norman King, 1988 to 1990 Rear Admiral David Dobson, 1990 to 1992 Rear Admiral Christopher Morgan, 1992 to 1994 Rear Admiral Malcolm Rutherford, 1994 to 1996 Rear Admiral Alan West, 1996 to 1998 Rear Admiral Fabian Malbon, 1998 to 2002 Rear Admiral Jeremy de Halpert, 2002 to 2004 Rear Admiral Mark Kerr, 2004–2005 Rear Admiral Peter Wilkinson, 2005 to 2008 Rear Admiral Richard Ibbotson, 2008 to 2010 Rear Admiral Charles Montgomery, 2010 to 2012 Rear Admiral David Steele, 2012 to 2015 Vice Admiral Jonathan Woodcock, 2015 present Rear Admiral Simon Williams.